As the joke goes, do you know what it means when the minister looks at the clock? Absolutely nothing. We're going to run long today, people, but I'm not going to cut what I have to say. My name is Phillip Baber. I'm the minister of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Jacksonville, and I am a racist. I engage in thoughts, beliefs, and actions that perpetuate a white supremacist culture that oppresses people of color in this country. Right now, the morning of September 20th, 2015, right now, we as a nation are witnessing the beginning of a new racial justice movement. Some argue it started at the beginning of this year with the extrajudicial killings of Michael Brown and Eric Garner. Others say it began in 2013 with the acquittal of the killer of Trayvon Martin right here in our own state of Florida. Others have persuasively argued that it actually started 10 years ago in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Wherever and whenever it began, I believe it is time for us as a church to talk about this new movement in greater depth. This morning, I'd like to talk a bit about why so many Americans, especially those who supported the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, or were brought up in the decades immediately following the civil rights movement, seem to be having so much difficulty embracing this movement and the anti-racist, anti-oppression, multiculturalist ideology that it represents. Racial justice is a topic loved by good liberals, and especially good white liberals. Somewhat surprisingly, though, many self-professed good white liberals have been bucking against this new modern, or shall we call it postmodern, movement for racial justice. And it's not just because Black Lives Matter operatives disrupted a Bernie Sanders campaign stop. The issues lie far deeper. If you are an American, my age or older, there are certain values and perspectives that have likely taken root in your heart and mind. Take the concept of racism itself, for example. Americans, especially my age and older, and especially the quote-unquote good liberals, have been taught, inculcated to believe that racism is horrible, terrible, morally repugnant. And it's good, I think, to tell ourselves that racism is horrible. I think it's good to tell our children that racism is horrible, because I think it is. But you see, there's a natural, though unintended, psychological consequence to making racism the unforgivable sin of America, the abomination which makes desolate. When anything becomes so wrong, so evil, it becomes impossible, or at the very least very difficult, for anyone to willingly admit that such an evil could possibly reside within them. Admitting that I harbor racist thoughts or engage in racist speech or actions would mean that I am a bad person. And as a good American, especially a good liberal, I pride myself on being the opposite. That kind of cognitive dissonance is so distasteful, so uncomfortable, that many of us white folk will do whatever we can to avoid it. From denying even the possibility that we harbor racist thoughts and ideas to becoming incredibly emotionally reactive and defensive whenever anyone would dare suggest that we might have said or done something that could be construed as racist. This is a psychological phenomenon dubbed white fragility by Dr. Robin DiAngelo, an expert in multicultural education. To be accused of any act of racism strikes at the core of our moral identities. And this is part of the reason why this new racial justice movement, spearheaded by Black millennials, is causing older generations so much anxiety. You see, current theory in the field of anti-racism and anti-oppression work identifies and defines racism far more broadly than the way the word was used in the civil rights era. In 2015, social scientists' understanding of what racism really is, how it affects all of us, dehumanizes all of us, how ubiquitous it truly is, how deeply it is embedded in our institutions and our individual psyches, our understanding of that racism has evolved. And that understanding should evolve. Over 50 or 60 years, we would hope and expect that any field of study would evolve with new insights and new advances. So the racial justice game has changed. The rules are different. Many of the things that you and I were taught decades ago about what it means to be anti-racist have, frankly, completely inverted. Old paradigms have become obsolete. And so trying to judge this new racial justice movement using an obsolete paradigm is like trying to put new wine into old bottles. And this is why I believe so many self-professed good liberals who supported the civil rights movement are having such a difficult time with what is happening right here and right now. And if we all are interested in adapting to the new climate we find ourselves in, it would behoove us to reconsider and redefine some terms. As it was generally applied in the 1950s and 60s, a racist was one, or a racist act, I should say, rather, was often understood to be an overt, intentional, self-aware, discriminatory act, usually steeped in prejudiced beliefs or attitudes that viewed and treated one race as inferior to another. And actually, that was a very good working definition in the 1950s and the 1960s because our world in those decades was full of examples of this kind of racism. From segregated toilets and water fountains to lynchings. This was the kind of racism that needed to be eradicated first. It was the most obvious and the most immediately harmful. And because of the hard work and sacrifice of many courageous black men and women in those years, much of that brand of overt, intentional, and self-aware racism came to an end, or at the very least, we can say that the injustice and evil of those acts came to be acknowledged and recognized by most Americans, such that most of us today would agree that those old expressions of racism were absolutely wrong and should have no place in a civilized nation. But that older definition of racism, which served a useful purpose decades ago, is too narrow for 2015. You see, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, as good and powerful as it was, it did not succeed in ending all racial oppression in America. Do you really think that hundreds of years of slavery and subjugation and Jim Crow and white supremacist brainwashing could truly be completely eradicated and reversed in only 1 or 2 decades? Even 1 or 2 generations? As one of my favorite poets, William Stafford, once wrote, "Justice will take us millions of intricate moves." In 2015, the fight for racial justice lives on, but the modes and the methods have in fact changed. Those on the front lines of this new movement are fighting a different kind of war, because they are fighting a different kind of foe, a different kind of racism, or at least a different expression of it. The racism and oppression they are fighting is not always as overt or obvious as the racism and oppression of the past, which in many ways makes it even more dangerous, even more insidious. Today's fight for justice will resemble the civil rights movement about as much as our current war on terror resembles World War II. Young people today, the millennials, are working with a new, broader, more expansive definition of the word racism than many of us older kids are accustomed to. For example, many of us olders still think that intent is a necessary component to make an act racist, and most millennials would disagree. And the more that I personally think about it, the more I think that they might be right. Let's say hypothetically I am speaking with a person of color. It's actually not hypothetical, this has happened to me. Let's say I'm speaking with a person of color and I casually say something that I sincerely thought was completely benign and non-racial. Let's say then that I am respectfully informed that what I have just said has a racist connotation to it and that it has hurt the person I'm speaking with. My default response is going to be, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to suggest anything racist. That wasn't my intent." I would then move on with my conversation, presuming my apology was sufficient and had been accepted because, well, of course it should be accepted. It's not racist if I didn't mean it to be. The person has no right to be hurt by me if I didn't intend to hurt them, right? Of course, this is fairly fallacious reasoning. See, if I accidentally, unintentionally hit your grandmother with my car, it would be somewhat presumptuous for me to glibly respond, whoopsies, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. We're still cool though, right? Of course we are, let's go get some lunch. It would be inappropriate for me to presume that my apology and explanation must be accepted by the person I have hurt, especially that quickly and with no further conversation on the subject. And to take it one more step, regardless whether the initial underlying statement I made was objectively racist, it is undoubtedly racist for me, the white person who made the remark, to act as sole arbiter and unilaterally decide what is or is not objectively racist without seeking input and perspective from the person of color to whom the remark was directed and who has potentially been harmed by it. In 2015, the new racial justice movement is attacking the root of racism, not just the most obvious fruit of it. It's attacking deeply ingrained systemic, institutional racism resulting from white supremacist thoughts, attitudes, beliefs, and habits. And here again, we probably need to redefine terms. For those my age and older especially, the term white supremacist conjures images of Ku Klux Klan burning crosses on lawns. In our common parlance, white supremacist is synonymous with super-duper racist. Adolf Hitler, after all, he was a white supremacist. So naturally, with this very narrow definition in mind, many of us in this room would be initially taken aback and become very defensive when we hear this term potentially being used in our direction. So I'd like to suggest a broader understanding of what this term means so that the term itself doesn't become a stumbling block in our attempts to understand and support racial justice in 2015. White supremacy is both an ideology and an operationalized form of racism that places the white race, the culture of whiteness, and being white, hierarchically above other races, above non-white cultures, above being a person of color. It is not just burning crosses. White supremacy happens when we think of white culture as the norm, or the standard against which all other cultures are to be judged or differentiated. White supremacist thinking is the kind of thinking that assumes the terms American and American culture, by default, refer to white Americans and white American culture, and that other types of Americans are the ones who need modifiers. Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans. That's a tragically comedic one. It's not that these modifiers are bad. They are quite descriptive and therefore useful. But when an individual uses these modifiers and consciously or unconsciously does not use the modifier white in front of the term American when speaking specifically about Caucasians, it suggests an embedded belief or attitude that white is the standard or norm by which all else will be judged. This is an example of white supremacy. I would argue that in 2015, white supremacist attitudes are not only prevalent, they are ubiquitous. All of us harbor attitudes, ideas, and beliefs that sprout from a white supremacist core or root because we have all been conditioned from birth by and within a white supremacist culture that is so ubiquitous it has become invisible. It is the water we swim in. Perhaps the greatest irony and tragedy is that white supremacist thinking is even embedded in the hearts and minds of many people of color as well. Social scientists call this phenomenon internalized racism. The most viscerally disturbing example of internalized racism may have been uncovered in a social psychology experiment known as the doll test. Some of you are nodding your head. In the 1940s, psychologists Kenneth and Mamie Clark designed a test in which they showed children of different races two dolls, a white doll and a black doll. And an interesting point to note here is that there actually were no black dolls that the Clarks could find in stores to purchase and use for the experiment. So they actually had to make their own brown-skinned dolls with black hair by adapting the white dolls. In this experiment, the vast majority of children, including a majority of the black children, said they preferred the white doll. They would rather play with the white doll. The white doll was prettier. The white doll was good. The black doll was ugly. The black doll was bad. Variations of the doll test have been performed over the decades. Different researchers have come to different conclusions, but even as late as 2005, there have been doll test experiments that have replicated the results found by the Clarks. So, to any enlightened, good white liberal who believes he or she is completely free of any stain of white supremacy, I will now echo the sentiments of Dr. Cornel West in his recent comments at the 2015 UUA General Assembly. If white supremacist attitudes and beliefs are still embedded in black Americans today, do you really think that somehow you don't also harbor white supremacist attitudes yourself? If we wish to support and become allies of this new racial justice movement, we need to begin the difficult process of examining ourselves first. We need to begin the process, and it is a process. It is a journey of critically looking at ourselves through the lens of current definitions of the anti-racist movement, instead of measuring ourselves against narrower, more comfortable definitions from half a century ago. We need to be willing to uncover, untangle, and uproot the white supremacist thinking, attitudes, and habits that we all harbor. And for those of us that are white, we need to become increasingly aware of the ways in which we have benefited from white privilege and understand the ways that our privilege influences the way we even see the world, the assumptions we make because of that privilege, the way this privilege affects how we interface with the world, especially people of color. We need to look critically at systems, structures, and policies that perpetuate white supremacy on an institutional level and the ways they intersect. We must attend to issues and policies like broken window policing, the militarization of local police forces, the for-profit prison industry, judicial sentencing guidelines, the drug war, white flight, gentrification, housing and real estate policies, education reform. The list could go on. Justice will take us millions of intricate moves. None of us alive today, black, white, brown, or yellow, none of us created this society. None of us here designed or directly implemented the systems of oppression that continue to perpetuate inequalities today. We all inherited it. We personally had no choice about that. Nevertheless, we today do still have a choice. On the one hand, we can choose to do nothing. We can choose to be willfully blind, willfully deaf, willfully ignorant to the massive inequalities and injustices that still exist in our world and thereby perpetuate those inequalities and those injustices, or we can choose another path. In honor of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, I'll frame this choice using the Jewish concept of tikkun olam, literally translated as repairing the world. Though none of us seated here today personally designed this unjust system, though none of us today personally broke this world, we can, nevertheless, choose to take up the collective responsibility, the sacred responsibility of repairing it. As a Unitarian Universalist congregation, we have done and continue to do much to incarnate justice in this world, to repair this world. We should be proud of those accomplishments. But I'm here this morning to remind all of us that there is still much more work to be done, and the time is ripe, full to bursting, actually. Blessed be.